Hi, welcome back to the Busy Corner. This is lesson 2. Today I'm going to show you how to do the back stitch or the knit stitch so that you can produce a garter stitch fabric. Unlike what I showed you in the first video, garter stitch, that was stockinette. This is the garter stitch. It lays flat, as you see. It's reversible. It's a different look altogether. This is 6 strands of mohair, 16 stitches across. It's just a long wrap with a fringe, and I did it on 1.5-inch pipe. This is 3 strands of mohair held together, but it is on 1-inch pipe, and it is 20 stitches across. So you see it's a much tighter weave. This was made on the same size rod. This is 2 strands of bulky yarn held together to create a long infinity scarf that I just sewed together. And this was also made on 1-inch pipe. So let's get started. We're going to use the knitting stand that I show you in lesson 4. But today, by the way, these little sticky mats are really good to put under your stand if you find it scooting across the table. We're going to use the 3/4-inch rods today. And we're just going to cast on 8 stitches with a number 6 bulky yarn. I'm going to turn this around. In fact, let me just take this off. This might be an easier way of doing this. So I'm going to go ahead and take this rod. You know, this is our 1/2-inch rod stand. This is 3/4-inch rod. And I'm going to hold these 2 strands together, make our figure 8, and make our slip knot. And we're going to cast on 8 stitches. So hold your tail around your thumb, your working yarn around your forefinger. Hold the 2 strands down to your palm with your ring finger and your pinky. Go under your tail, under your working yarn, then bring the tail piece back over. Now you have 2 on. Go under your tail, under your working yarn, and bring that tail back over. And that gives you 3. Under your tail, under your working yarn. You wouldn't be able to do it this way if you were using the larger rods, but for these small ones, this is just fine. Going to have to help it under that tail a little bit. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Here's 6. Here's 7. And here's 8. Turn your stand around. Now, I find with these 3/4-inch pipes, because they are thin-walled and they're lighter weight, they want to slip up off of your rod stand. Unlike the heavier rods, or the thicker rods, I guess I should say. These are quite a bit heavier. They'll stay in place better as you're working. So it's just these 3/4-inch rods. I just take a toothpick and slip it between the rods, and that will prevent that from sliding up and down. So we're going to start as we did in lesson 1. We're going to start with the front stitch, or what really produces the purl fabric as it's facing you. Knitting on these rods is a little more like knitting on circular needles, because you work from one rod to the other and back again, unlike straight knitting needles where you're always working the stitches from the left to the right. So because you don't turn your knitting over as you do in traditional knitting, that's why you need to know this second stitch to do something like a garter stitch. Otherwise, you would produce a garter stitch fabric if I did the same stitch over and over like I did in lesson 1. But let's start with this front stitch like we did in lesson 1. Hold your 2 strands. You're going to use 2 strands together. Hold them in your right hand. Bring your old stitch off. Hold it over your working yarn. Grab it with your thumb and forefinger. Put it on the pipe. Don't turn it this time, because you're going to be doing a garter stitch it's not necessary to do that. But you're going to make every stitch the same way, pulling the stitch off over your working yarn, grabbing it with your thumb and forefinger and putting it up on the left rod. If you walk away from your knitting in the middle of a row, just remember that your working yarn is following the new stitches. So I know that I'm still working from right to left because my working yarn is over here on the left. Make sure you always take both your strands, or however many strands you're working with, obviously. Okay, there's your first row done. Now you're going to switch to the back stitch because you're going to do garter stitch, and you want to make a whole row of back stitches. You have two ways of doing this. The important thing is that you bring your yarn up, because now you want to bring your working yarn through the back of the stitch. So you can bring your yarn up. Let me backtrack here a little bit. Bring your yarn up. Use this hand to push the old stitch off onto your finger. Lay your yarn over that stitch. Just grab it, almost hook it with your forefinger, and put it up on the opposite pipe. Kind of take your fingers down below. Hold that old stitch while you pull your working yarn a little bit. The yarn comes back up. You're going to repeat what you just did the first time. Lay your working yarn over that old stitch, hook it with your forefinger, put it up on the pipe. Yarn comes up, stitch comes off, yarn comes over, it gets hooked through and up on the pipe. I think when you are working with the smaller pipes, especially the 1/2 inch pipe, it's much easier to work the stitch below the needles because you don't have as much play between the stitches as you do when it's a looser. For instance, if you're working with the 1.5 inch diameter rods. So there's your whole row done in your back stitch or your knit stitch. So now you come back to the right hand side. I'm doing every other row. So now I have to do another row of front stitches or purl stitches. Every time bring your yarn up, not too far up. You don't want to drop them off the end of your needle, or your rod. Every stitch is made the same way. You'll see in the next couple videos we do like a purl one, knit one. So that's a different, every other stitch will change. But not when you're doing garter stitch. You want to make the whole row the same way. Okay, now you're back to the left side. Now if you want to keep in your mind, well, let's see, my even number rows are going to be my back stitches or my knit stitch. That's fine. Here's another way you can make that knit stitch or back stitch if you prefer. Especially if you're working with the larger needles, you can bring your stitch off. You have your yarn back, bring your stitch off and hold it against your working yarn. Bring your working yarn through and put it on the pipe. Keep your yarn up here, up above the stitches. Bring off the next stitch, hold it against your working yarn, pull the working yarn through, put it on the pipe. I think this is a little more uncomfortable for me, for my shoulder. And I think it's actually a little more awkward on these smaller rods, but I think however you get there, it doesn't matter. Whatever you think is the easiest and the most comfortable. And again, I think on the smaller rods it's easier to work the stitches below, but this is a little faster when you're working with the big rods, so I would experiment. And again, you don't need to turn your first stitches like you did in the stockinette. And you can already see now what you're getting is a garter stitch. Both sides are the same. It lays flat. If, by the way, you're working on a piece and you want to transport it and you take your pipes off your rod and you say to yourself, uh-oh, you know, how did they go back on there? Was that on the left or the right? just remember your working yarn has to be at the front. Whenever, it's always going to be at the front, whatever side it is on when you start the row. And the other thing is your working yarn should always be to the inside. So if I pick up my pipe and I'm uncertain about where it belongs, all I need to see is where that working yarn is falling. If it's falling towards this side, then I know that has to be on the right. Because your working yarn, whether you're working on the right or the left, is always going to be to the inside. So this row, give a little more space here. This row is going to be another front stitch or purl stitch. And it's just as you made in the preceding rows. Bring your working yarn off, or bring your stitch off. Just hold that little loop of that old stitch. When you pull your working yarn, it'll snug it up there just right. And then I just snug up each next row by kind of holding that a bit, pulling. If these pipes spin, that doesn't matter, as long as they don't pull off this way. They don't have to be locked on there. Let's do one more back stitch, or the knit stitch. So, let's put that back up there a second. Bring your yarn up. Always have your yarn up. This way, when you take your stitch off, your yarn can come right over. Otherwise, you're jostling your yarn and your stitch, and it's easy to lose one or the other. So, yarn up, stitch off, yarn over. Now, let's say you kind of lost track. Oh, let's see, was my, even row, was my left row, my purl, or my knit? Take your stitch off and look at it. If you see that the previous stitch is going under here, then I know my last stitch, my last row in this case, was the front stitch or the purl stitch, and I know that I need to do something opposite this time. I'm going to create what I call the little bow tie. So I know this has to go over the top. So if you lose track and you've lost track, say this looks the same way as the preceding stitch. You don't see the little bow tie image that I point out. It's on the other side. It's underneath. So this has to be a back stitch. And each of these will be made the same way. We're going to make one more row in this front stitch, and then I'll show you how to bind off. If you want something a little looser, you could even try one strand. And then as you make your pieces, write down what you did and how big that skein of yarn was, and that way you can keep track for next time. So now let's say I want to bind off. Obviously I'd want my piece to be bigger, but so now I have to bind off in the manner in which the stitches, in pattern it's called, binding off in pattern. So this row is going to be the back stitch or the knit stitch. So I need to make a back stitch. I need to make another back stitch, so the yarn comes up, stitch comes off, working yarn gets held over, make your stitch. Now take off the first stitch you made, just slip it over the last stitch. And you've bound off one stitch. Make another stitch, again using the back stitch or the knit stitch. Bring your yarn over the last stitch you made. Take off that first one, over the last stitch you made. And this is your last one. Bring that over. Now you're left with one. And you would just cut this yarn, bring the yarn all the way through, and that would tie off that row. And that is how you produce garter stitch on the stationary rods.